My name is Russ Gautier. I'm the art director at a studio called Perception in New York City. Today we're going to be discussing cinematic techniques in Cinema 4D, specifically how we use Cinema 4D and how you can use Cinema 4D to achieve some of the things that we put up on the big screen. So before we get started with cinema, just really quick, a little bit about who Perception is and what we do. So Perception was founded in 2001 by Jeremy Lasky and Danny Gonzalez. We are based in New York City. We are a team of multidisciplinary designers from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, 2D, 3D, UI, UX, everything. We do a ton. And we have a very unique focus. That unique focus is what we call prototyping the future. So what exactly is prototyping the future? Prototyping the future is applying principles like UX, design, both 2D and 3D, obviously. We spend a lot of time doing 3D. Animation and visual effects to two primary pillars, film and tech. So on the film side of things, we do, of course, design, we do animation, we do visual effects, we do title sequences, we do what is called FUI, which is like futuristic user interface, so things like Iron Man holograms, and most recently had done a ton of work on Black Panther, which we'll discuss a little bit today. So on the film side of things, we've worked on Black Panther, Thor Ragnarok, Spider-Man Homecoming, all the Avengers movies, Batman vs. Superman, et cetera, et cetera. There's a ton of work. We've had a long-standing relationship with Marvel Studios, which has been really fantastic, really wonderful people there. On the other side of things, we spend our other half of our time working for big tech companies. So we've been fortunate enough to work on early development for things like the Microsoft HoloLens, developing UI concepts for the Microsoft HoloLens. We got a chance to help with early days on like the Samsung Galaxy when they were working on their UI design. We were fortunate enough to get our hands on a little bit of the 2017 Ford GT, which is a really cool project where we were doing things like dash cluster design and that kind of thing for the concept car. Really fun. And then, of course, there's a ton of stuff that I can't talk about. It's all, super tight-lipped NDA stuff. But it's really cool. It's really fun stuff. And all of these things really feed into each other. They create this sort of like infinite loop because, of course, all these, the executives from these big tech companies, they go watch movies, they go see Marvel movies, and they think like, oh, how can I get that kind of cinematic influence into my product? And at the same time, when Marvel Studios comes to us and they ask us to develop some really wild out there technology, they ask us to bring a little bit of that real world with us, something that feels like a little believable, something that doesn't necessarily feel like completely magical and fantastic, but is somehow grounded in the real world. And that's something that I really want to discuss today. So today I really want to talk about Black Panther and some of the work that we did on Black Panther. For this movie, this was by far our largest engagement with Marvel Studios. It was about 18 months of work that we put into this movie. And it really started with a discussion about technology. They had come to us like very early days in their development. Wakanda, which is where Black Panther takes place, is a highly technologically advanced society. They're built on this mountain of, or a comet of a material called vibranium. If you're familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's what Captain America's shield is made out of. It is everything that powers Wakanda, everything about it. It's really, quite a substance. So they came to us and they asked us, what are some really out there sort of fringe technologies that we could start to incorporate into some of these things? So we did a bunch of technical development on almost all of the major technical moments in the movie. We had done like previs and development and conceptualizing of how these technologies work. you can see all this stuff right now. If you go, there's just a ridiculous amount of stuff, way too much to cover in my short time here. But you can see our entire full case study at experienceperception.com. And this morning, both the Perception and my Twitter account tweeted out direct links to some of our case study elements, as well as our Black Panther reel, which you guys can check out at experience or exp_perception and at robot astronaut _, that's mine. So back to Black Panther. One of the things that we developed, one of our sort of keystone technologies that appeared throughout the movie, as well as the so we were fortunate enough to spend several weeks doing previs and development for the prologue at the beginning of the movie. If you've seen it, it's this like really amazing history lesson of Wakanda that's all rendered in sand. Done by some really fantastically talented folks, and we had a chance to do previs and development for that. And then we had actually done the title sequence at the end of the movie, which was all done in sand as well. So sand was sort of this keystone technology and element that was present throughout the entire movie. If you saw it, there's like sand holograms, there's sand interfaces, really, really cool stuff. Sand was a big thing for us. So we needed a way to execute sand, and so we turned to Cinema 4D, and we love working in Cinema 4D. This is our primary 3D package. It is incredibly powerful. Just really quick, why we like to use Cinema 4D as a studio. It is really a 3D designer's tool. So, like, it really allows somebody who doesn't necessarily have, like, a large background in visual effects or, you know, crazy 3D development to really get in and tweak and push and pull and make things very quickly. It's very fast. It's very accessible and easy. So, for the first-time user, it's really easy to get your hands on and make some fantastic things. But it also goes really, really deep. The more you dive into it, the more you realize that these features are incredibly powerful and really, really cool. It's a fantastic program. So back to sand. Sand is kind of a tricky beast. Sand is, it's a weird thing. Like, you wouldn't think so, because really, at the end of the day, sand is, it's just little rocks, right? Like, it's not anything special. It's just tiny little rocks. But that's kind of why sand is such a tricky element to work with and to build, right? You can't just take a picture of sand and map it to a 3D object and have it look just like sand. Like, it just doesn't work. And the reason for that really is, and you'll have to forgive my poor quality iPhone video that I shot in the office, but as you can see here, there's like a randomized highlight or like fall off. Like, each of these little rocks has like facets and reflections and refractions, and that's what makes sand such a tricky element to generate in 3D, at least in a shader, right? Because we could scatter a billion particles on a 3D object and turn it into sand that way, but that gets really, really heavy. Even for a program like Cinema, that becomes really, really intense. So our sand shader needs, we needed to be able to develop a sand shader that was both fast and flexible. It needed to be. It needed to be scalable, so it needed to be able to work for a human, and it needed to be able to work for like a bridge. Like, it needed to work at all scales. It definitely needed to be client and comment friendly, because the pressure is really high on these jobs, as you can imagine. If they wanted to make it more glinty, less glinty, we needed to be able to react to that very, very quickly. And then, last but not least, it needed to be consistent for stereo, because we were delivering left and right eye for this movie, so we needed to be able to make sure that the glints were exactly the same in the left eye as they were in the right eye, because otherwise you get something called rivalries, and it just looks like weird. It doesn't look right. So we needed to make sure that it was consistently repeatable. We couldn't use just random scattering of elements that we couldn't repeat again and again and again. So that's really sort of the motivation behind our sand shader. So what I'm going to do for you guys today is actually build a version of our sand shader just really quickly so you guys can see exactly how we put this thing together. And to do that, I've pulled out a lovely Raptor model out of the content browser, and we're going to turn this Raptor model into sand today. So I've got a very, very simple setup, just a simple camera move on this guy. So we pull out of the mouth, and we get sort of a nice rotation around, and then we're back in. We have just 3 really simple lights. I've got like a really strong rim light back here. I've got sort of a secondary rim light over here, and I've got just a fill light just to get a little bit in there. But we have no textures or anything. So if I hit the render button on this thing, right now you can see it's just a gray, flat, nothing, like there's no shading to it. I've also got in here a couple subdivision objects so I can turn up the subdivisions on this thing and make it look nice and smooth. But for the moment, I think I'm going to leave those off just for the sake of speed so I can make sure to get through this for you guys. So the first thing we're going to do, we're actually going to make a brand new material. I'm going to drop this onto the teeth and then onto the body. I've actually got the teeth separated out because later I'll apply a displacer. I didn't want to displace the teeth. They get a little funny. So we're going to build a color shader first. And we're going to do this using Cinema 4D's noise shaders, which are absolutely incredible. Like if you've ever used Cinema 4D's noise shaders, you know how complex and how deep and how fast they are. They're really, really amazing. So we're going to build this entire thing using noise shaders. So in here, in my color material, first of all, the very first thing I'm going to do is name this color, just so I can keep everything straight. In the color channel, I'm going to drop in my first noise. And if I give this a quick render, you're not going to see a whole lot. It's got very broad noise on it. It doesn't really quite look like sand at all. So we're going to fix that. I'm going to go in here. The first thing I'm going to do is change the random seed to just a random value. It comes with a default value, but I'm going to change it up just so, just to keep it random. And under noise, we have all of these different types of noise we can apply to this. I'm going to apply something called Booyah. We're going to go with Booyah. I like Booyah because it's a very high contrast shader. You can see here it's got lots of really dark values and lots of really light values so that we can really kind of get something that feels like very grainy out of that, right? So right now it's going to be a little big. If I hit the render button, it's going to look a little gigantic. And there it goes. Okay. Cool. We're going to make that much smaller. I'm going to say like 3%. And before I go any further, I'm actually going to jump over here into After Effects. We're going to save this project file really fast. I'm just going to drop it right to the desktop. And we're going to name this. So we're actually going to do a little bit of look dev using Cineware with this guy as well. So you get a little extra look at how some of this works. So I'm going to bring this Cinema 4D file. I'm actually just taking the Cinema 4D file right into After Effects. So like no exporting, no rendering, no nothing, just taking the whole thing right into AE. And here it is. I'm going to drop it into a comp, just like any old layer. I'm going to turn off pre-calculation. I'm going to turn on keep textures in RAM. And I'm going to tell the renderer to be standard final, because right now you can see it's giving me like a software preview render. I want that to be like standard final. And I'm going to go out to like frame 40 where I can really see the full Raptor, right? And one of these days it'll work for me. Cool. While that's doing its thing, there we go. Beautiful. All right, so there's my current version of the Sand Raptor rendered as a frame, so I can take a look at that, right? Doesn't look like sand just yet. It just sort of looks like a, I don't know, weird noisy clay or something. And part of that is because the specular fall off right now is this very broad kind of fake specular fall off, which I don't want to see. So we're going to go in. The next thing we're going to do is actually change the reflectance channel. So I'm going to come in here to the reflectance channel. I'm going to delete this default specular. I'm going to get that out of here. And I'm going to add a GGX. Right now, that turns it into a mirror. That's not going to work very well. So one thing I want to do is make sure I get pretty aggressive with the roughness. I'm going to take the roughness up to like 60%. So it's more rough and ragged. Like you don't see like little shiny bits in sand. They're always, very kind of broad. So the next thing I want to do is add, again, another noise. So I'm going to come down here to my texture tab. I'm going to go to noise. Look at that. And I'm going to change my random seed to just some number. And in here, I think this time I'm going to use dents. I'm going to use dents. If I go up just a little bit, you can kind of see what dents look like here in the preview. And I know that this texture is going to be really, really big because the last one was really, really big. So this one I'm going to take down, I'm going to say like 3%. I'm going to go ahead and save this really quick. I'm going to pop back over to After Effects. And we're going to wait for that. Maybe we go back a frame, see if it'll refresh itself. It's like rendering in the background as we're doing this. So the reason I want to do this is so that I have a chance to tweak the look of these materials in After Effects before I go ahead and render this thing out. Because I don't want to wait, 45 minutes or, 20 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it is to get this thing rendered out. Okay, so there we go. That's currently what we've got. So I'm happy with the scale, but the distribution is a little intense at the moment. So I think what I'm going to do is come down to, here, I'm just going to expand this up so we can see this. I'm going to change this low clip value, and I'm going to get pretty aggressive with the low clip. I'm going to take it up to like 50%. And you can kind of see what that's done. It's clipped all the values in the noise below 50%. So everything that's below 50% is now black, which means it's not going to have any specular effect whatsoever. I might even take that up higher because I feel like that might be a little low. There we go. All right, we'll go to 66. We'll try that. I'm going to give that a quick save. Pop back over to After Effects. Let that do its thing. And then we should see something that looks a little bit more like sand, a little less like a weird, there we go. That's looking a little better. Cool. So that's looking a little bit more sandy, right? Let's go ahead and add in this, let's add a bump channel. Bump channel is a nice thing to have here, just to keep the variation in the light and shadow across the surface of the Raptor a little less even, because right now it's going to be very even and predictable. So again, I'm going to add a noise, same thing. We're just going to change a random value here. And I think I'm going to use Booyah again for this guy. And let's change the Gerbil scale to, let's try 4%. Let's see what that does. Give it a quick save. Pop back over to AE. We're going to see that update here in a second. It's not going to be a huge difference, but when you render this thing out, it will add like some nice subtlety to the way that the specular highlight falls off. So it's not a huge difference, but it does add a little bit of something. So the next thing I want to look at is if I drop like a solid behind here. Let's throw just like a white solid back here, let's say. All right? White solid, throw it back here. Right now, this silhouette of this thing is very even. It's very geometric. So if I go back in to Cinema and I turn on my my subdivisions, this will get nice and smooth, and it'll kind of accentuate what I'm talking about here, where we've got this like really hard edge. It's not really something you would see if this was really made of sand, right? Like this like nice hard geometric shape just doesn't feel sandy. So one thing I'm doing in here is I threw in a Displaced Deformer, and what this is doing is it's adding a little bit of that edge noise to it to kind of break up some of that silhouette. And let's pop back into After Effects and see what that's doing. One of these days it'll render. There we go. It's coming in. So what that's going to do is just give the edges like a little bit of sandy look to it. So we don't even have to scatter geometry on this thing. We could totally scatter a whole bunch of clones on this thing, and that would help break up that silhouette as well, which is fantastic. So there we go. We've got like a nice little silhouette breakup, so it feels like it's got little grains of sand that are breaking up that edge, right? So the next thing to do would be to render this out, and that would be really boring for you guys to sit here and watch. So I'm not going to make you watch it. I'm just going to pull in a render that I've already got. So I'm going to bring in my base color render that I've already got. And I'm just going to alt drag it right into place, right over this guy. So we're going to alt drag that, just like that. There we go. And I'm going to change its interpolation to 24 frames a second. There we go. Cool. So what we have, if I turn off this white solid, if I let this play, you can see we've got this like nice noise going on, right? But it still doesn't look like sand. It still looks like just sort of like a rock or a granite or something. Like, it doesn't look sandy. It doesn't have that sparkle to it. So the sparkle is the next thing we're going to do. And this is really the key to making a sand shader look much more like sand. So we're going to jump right back in here to Cinema. And I'm going to make a new material. And I'm going to call this material Glints. Glints, just like that. And this one's going to be a super, super simple material. It's just going to be a luminance material, and that's it. So I'm going to drop that onto my two pieces of geometry here. And in here, we're going to use yet another noise. Love noise. And for this one, I think we'll use Booyah again. Maybe we'll use Dense. Let's try Dense. Let's see what that looks like. We're going to shrink this down again pretty far. I'm not going to go quite as far as some of the other passes I've done, which have been like the 4 or 5% range. I think I'm going to go like maybe 6 or 7%. Let's try that. And I know that this is off the bat way too many glints, I can see here. So I'm going to get really aggressive with the low clip again, and I'm going to make it just a handful of glints. So I'm just going to give this a quick save, pop back over into After Effects, and I'm actually going to take this same Cinema 4D file and drop it right on top. Just like that, and we're going to let that cook. Oh, and I got to change some of these settings here. Standard final, keep textures in RAM, just so it doesn't look like this. And we're going to let that think for a second, and then there we go. Cool. So it doesn't look like sand yet, but we're getting there. We're making some progress. So this will be our glint pass, right? So again, we're going to render this thing out, and thankfully I've already done that, so you guys don't have to watch me do it. So we're going to go grab my glint pass. We're going to bring that right in. And again, I'm going to alt-drag that right here. Cool. So obviously my glint pass was a little bit different from the one I was just showing, but it's the same idea. The great thing about this is that you can really do this in any of the renderers, which is awesome. So if I hit play, this is just a static noise mapped to this geometry. Again, not very sandy, right? Doesn't quite have that like glintiness to it. In fact, it probably looks even less like sand than the last one did. But the next step is sort of where the magic really happens. And that's, we're going to make a third material. We're going to drop that on here. And this material, we're just going to call this, I don't know, we'll call it noise. How about that? There we go. And again, this one is going to be a luminance material. And for this one, again, we're just going to use a noise. Well, we're going to use a different noise for this guy. I'm going to change this random value. We're going to come down here. We're going to use Cell Voronoi. And the reason I like Cell Voronoi for this particular task, I'll show you here in After Effects. So we're just going to, again, grab my Cinema 4D file, drag it right on top. We're going to say standard final. We're going to say no pre-calculation, keep textures in RAM. We're going to let that cook for just a second. And you'll see what we get is a raptor with these like big plates of color, right? So I know that's way too big. I don't want it to be that big, but I don't want it to be super tiny either. So let's try like 12% scale on this thing. And give that a quick save. Pop back to After Effects, see what that's done for us. So we should see like those plates kind of shrink down, right? So we've got these sort of big plates of noise that are in here. We don't have a lot of black values. We don't have a lot of white values. We have a lot of like sort of medium grays. And that's kind of exactly what I want for this particular task, which, you know, of course, I've already rendered this thing for you guys, so you don't have to watch me do it. I'm going to bring in my noise render right here. Say, okay, we're just going to alt-drag that, just like we've been doing, right back on top here. And got to set this interpret footage for 24 frames a second. There we go. Cool. And if I let this RAM preview, you can see here, again, no animation in this thing whatsoever. So you're like, why are you doing this? There's no glints or anything happening. But what we're going to do, we're going to use this ancient, weird plugin for After Effects under here in Color Correct. Colorama. And as soon as I drop this thing on here, it's going to turn like crazy rainbow colors, right? If you've ever used Colorama, it's a wacky plugin. So I drop it on here, and wow, I've now gone the furthest from sand that I've been so far, right? Like this looks insane. But what's happening here really is if I jump back here and go under Effects. There we go. We don't need this Cineware. That can go away. Cool. So what's going on here exactly is if I turn this off for just a second, what it's doing is it's taking those gray values and it's mapping them to this color wheel from black to white, right? So it's taking all those gray values and it's remapping them to this insane rainbow color wheel. I don't really want rainbow color wheel. All I want is really a gray. So I'm going to come under here and I'm going to go to ramp gray. And now it's going to look pretty much exactly like it looked before. But what this allows me to do is now it allows me to kind of remap these gray values. So I'm going to drop in just a couple black values, a couple white values. I'm going to do this here. So I'm basically just kind of breaking up this color wheel a little bit so that it's not quite so even. You know, I kind of want to randomize this a little bit. All right, so now I've got this thing, and now this looks a lot more contrasty, right? Like I've got a lot more blacks, I've got a lot more whites. The power of Colorama really comes in this input phase tab where I can change the phase shift. So what this is going to allow me to do is basically cycle through the gray values and remap them based on this input, right? This sort of phase shift. So what that lets me do, if you guys are familiar with After Effects, let's get rid of this. That's going to let me take this and use it as a luma mat for my glints. So now I've got my glints layer underneath. I've got this crazy noise, and when I animate this, all right, if I set my glints to something like a screen mode, you won't see the black values in there. There we go. So now I can animate through this, and you can see, even though I'm sitting still, I've got this like glintiness happening on my sand shader, right? So I'm just going to set a couple of keyframes. I'm going to say we've got this big move right here that kind of eases in at this point. I'm going to go to phase shift and set a keyframe, like reveal those. And we'll like scooch this. So we get this, and then down here at about frame 90, I want to change this value so we get some glintiness over that time, and then we get another big move right at the end, right? So we're going to really get aggressive with this wheel. And I'm going to do a little, just a little ease in and a little ease out at the end here, just like that. Cool. So now when I hit this, it's RAM previewing a little slow. You can see, though, I've got like a little bit of like glintiness happen. And thankfully, I've actually done a little comp on this guy and rendered it out for you so you can see what this looks like with a little bit of love applied. So this is my Sand Raptor with that sand shader applied to it. So that's sort of a rough version of this sand shader, and this is what we did for a good chunk of the title sequence in Black Panther. This is the method that we used, and it really allowed us to be very flexible with client comments and everything, which was awesome. Cool. So moving on to Cymatics. So we're going to talk a little bit about Cymatics. Cymatics was another component of the Black Panther work that we had done, and Cymatics is. If you want to get technical about it, it's the visual manifestation of sound through some medium, right? So like salt or sand or, a ferrofluid or something. But really, you can kind of think of it as like if you take a plate of salt and you put it on a speaker and you play just the right consistent tone through that speaker, that sand or salt is going to arrange itself into these really cool organic patterns. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Cymatics are absolutely incredible. Really, really cool. So we felt like this was a fantastic sort of world to play in for some of the Black Panther sand stuff, right? Particularly like vibranium, like it responds to sound in really unique ways. So it sort of made sense that Cymatics were going to be a part of this. So we did a ton of this for the tech development. We did a ton of this in the title sequence as well. So Cymatics were a big part of what we had done. So I want to show you guys today how you can do something like this in Cinema 4D. And for that, I actually have a little Python script that I developed. So I'm not going to bore you with the details of what's actually in the Python script. We'll make it available for everybody so you can download it and check it out and pull it apart and do your thing. But I will show you just a little bit about what's going on under the hood. So I've got this sort of little Photoshop demo, right? And before we dive into this, let's do this. Let's make some geometry in Cinema 4D first. So what I like to do is actually start with like a disk or like a circle shape, right? But I don't want to use the regular disk because the regular disk has like a very radial distribution of points. So you get more points, you get more densely packed points in the middle than you do on the outside edges, and it creates some kind of uneven geometry sometimes. So I'm going to make my own sort of weird disk, and I'm going to use a plane for that. And I'm going to take the plane, I'm going to take its width and height segments down to 1. I'm going to make it editable. And I'm going to drop that into a subdivision surface. And I'm going to crank that subdivision surface up to 6, as high as it'll go. And I'm going to make that editable as well. Cool. So here we have a roughly circular shaped object that has a much more even distribution of points across the surface, right? So when we apply something like a displacement, we're going to get a lot more even displacement than we would with like a disk shape. And I'm going to rename this. We're just going to call this base object, just to get started. Cool. So what I've done, I've actually got some images from, that's the wrong folder. I've got some images that I rendered out of After Effects that I'm going to use as a displacement, essentially. So I've got these guys. So these are just rendered out of After Effects. And all they really are is just a radio emitter, just duplicated 3 times and rotated around. So I've got one on each side, and they're all emitting sort of simultaneously. And then I'm doing a little bit of blurring and a little bit of crunching of levels to get these kind of shapes, right? So these are sort of vaguely cymatic. They're not actually cymatic patterns, because for that we need some like resonant frequency simulations and everything. We're not going to do that. But we can make something that looks relatively close. The nice thing about this is we could also pipe in other things as well. It doesn't have to be a cymatic-like pattern. It could be literally anything, which is what we did for the movie. So I took these things out of After Effects, and I'm going to bring them into Cinema 4D here as a displacer. So I'm going to displace this base geometry object I've got here. I'm going to go into shading, and I'm going to bring in one of these materials. Let's bring in, let's say, this guy. I'm going to say, no, we don't need to do that. So what we get is this kind of shape here, right? So the areas that are black are moving down. So if I look at it from the side, the areas that are black are moving down. The areas that are white are moving up. I actually want to make sure that the areas that are black don't move down at all. So I'm going to go into Object, and I'm going to change that from Intensity Centered to just Intensity. And what that's going to do is it's going to limit all of the black values to a Y position of 0 and push all the white values up, just based on that image. So you get this kind of shape here, right? And I'm actually going to take this height up a little bit. Let's say like 25, right? Okay. So here we have this sort of like weird kind of undulating shape based on this symmetrical pattern that I had developed in After Effects. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply my little Python script. So now I'll show you guys, before we actually do this, sort of a little bit what's going on under the hood. If we imagine that 3D shape, that sort of shape that's all over the place, if we imagine that as just a line, right? We aren't going to visualize this in 3 dimensions, you said. We're going to keep it 2D. If we imagine this as just a line with a handful of points on it, what the script is doing is it's establishing a threshold in the Y position. So it says points below this line, we're not going to move at all. We're going to leave these points alone. Points above that line, these guys up here, what they're going to do, if I make a new layer, I can actually draw on here for you. So what they're going to do is they're going to go through every single point that's above that threshold, and they're going to find their closest point below the threshold. So like this point here, this guy, forgive my drawing with a mouse, ouch. This guy is going to look, and he's going to find this point down here is the closest one. Same thing with this one. This one's going to look, and this down here is the closest point to that point. This one is going to likewise be looking at this point here. This one I drew in the middle, so we're going to say, sure, it's looking over here. This one here, likewise. So So basically, it's going to go through every single point above that threshold, and it's going to find a point below the threshold that is closest to its position. And then what the script is going to do is it's going to flatten everything out, so it's no longer going to be like a wavy line. It's going to flatten it all out, and then it's going to move all of those points close to the points that it was closest to. So that sort of looks something like this, where it's gone from this sort of wavy line to now a flat line, and all the points are kind of squished together. So essentially what it's doing is it's taking a displacer that was displacing in Y, so it's displacing up, and it's making it displace in instead, based on a black and white image. So we're going to run that script really quick. So I'm going to take this object. Ooh, there we go. And we're going to right-click, and I'm going to say current state to object. So what that's going to do is it's going to bake that displacer into that object. So I don't have to have the displace deformer on there anymore. And I'm just going to hide this object with a displacer. And we're going to call this cymatic 1. Sure. So on my constrict points null object, I've got this user data field, and all it wants is an object to deform. So I'm going to drop this object in here, this cymatic 1 object. I'm going to put that in there. I'm going to leave these settings alone, but the multiplier basically tells it how far, how aggressive to move those points towards the areas that are white. I've got this sort of fall-off curve that would allow basically a distance-based fall-off to exist. And then I've got execute and reset. I apologize in advance. My Python skills are just enough to be dangerous, so hopefully this works for you guys if you get a chance to play with it. So I'm going to hit the little execute button, and what that's going to do is make this geometry look real weird as soon as it's done. There we go. Cool. So essentially what it's done, like I said, is flatten everything out so it's flat as a pancake, and it's moved all of those points that were on the outside edges, it's moved them in. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm actually going to duplicate this base object. The way we're going to move these points, we are going to use a PoseMorph. If you guys have ever used a PoseMorph before, it's basically, it takes two objects with the same number of points, and it moves the points from the one object shape to the other object shape. So I'm going to show you what that does. And it's actually a really nice illustration of what this script really did behind the scenes once I get this up and running. So we're going to drop in, we're going to go into tags, we're going to go to character tags. We're going to go to PoseMorph. We're going to throw this in here. And you can deform all of these kind of properties. What we're going to do is deform points. And when you click points, now we get this interface. We have a base pose, which is essentially what we're looking at here. And we have pose 0, which is going to be sort of the next pose in line. And if I twirl down this advanced tab, I can actually drop in my cymatic 1 object as a target. And now it's going to sort of move all those points to where they were on that target object. So I have base pose, and I have pose 0, which is my cymatic target. So when I go over to animate, now I get this slider, right? So this is actually a really good illustration of what that script does. So as I slide this down, you can see it's moved those points close. It's essentially displaced them inwards based on that black and white image that I had. So I've got this working pretty well here. That's cool. But I actually think this looks a little even. And to illustrate that, I think what I'm going to do is we're going to make this now sort of look a little bit more like sand by using a cloner object. I'm going to clone just a cube. We're just going to take a cube and make that cube pretty small and make it 1 by 1 by 1. And I'm going to throw that into a cloner object, just like this. And if you've not played with a cloner object before, it does exactly what it says it does. It takes an object that's underneath its hierarchy and duplicates it many, many times. In this case, it's duplicating it 3 times in Y. In each case, it's moving it up 50 centimeters. Not really what I want it to do. So I'm going to change this to object mode. And I'm going to drag my base object 1 into the object here. Boop, just like that. And what it's going to do is it's going to put one of those cubes on every single vertex that's on that object. And once it does that, you'll be able to see that what it's doing is creating a very sort of even pattern. All right, there we go. Cool. It just needed a little refresh. So what it's doing, this doesn't look like sand at all. It looks like a grid in a circle, right? So I can sort of check what this PoseMorph is doing. If I slide this, you can see now exactly what's doing. It's taking all those points and it's moving them based on that grayscale image that I had. It still doesn't look like sand. It looks very regular, but we're going to change that right now. So I'm actually going to turn off this cloner really quick, and I'm going to go back to my base object. And I'm going to use if I go up under MoGraph, I'm going to go use a random effector. A random effector usually in the past has been used for MoGraph objects specifically, but I'm going to use it as a deformer for my base object. So I'm going to throw that under here. And I'm going to go to the Deformer tab, and I'm going to set that to point. Right now, it looks like a giant mess, as you would imagine. Like it's moving points in every direction. It looks crazy. But we can reduce that down a little bit. If we go back to parameter, I'm going to set this to like 1 in X, 1 in Y, and 0 in Z. So let's go a little more than that. Let's say 2 and 2, right? So now we're kind of disturbing those points a little bit. They aren't going up and down. Like if I look at the side view, you can see the side view is perfectly flat because I haven't disturbed it at all in the Y-axis. I've only messed with it like as it's on that single plane. Now, when I turn this off and I turn my cloner back on, you can see we'll have points. Let's give this a little refresh. Slide this guy, there we go. Okay, so now we're much less even, right? We have points that are scattered, they feel a little bit more random, which is exactly what we want. And then when we start sliding this slider, it starts to feel like we've got these sort of more organic groupings of particles. They're not stuck in a grid anymore, which is really nice. That's sort of what we want. The only other thing I want to do with this is right now, if I go back to look at my geometry, and I slide this slider, everything moves very evenly, right? They all kind of move at the same time. I want to add a little bit of flair to that. And I want to have those move from the center out. So not just moving all at the same time. In order to do that, I'm going to go under the deformers, and I'm going to grab a Morph Deformer. And what this is going to allow me to do, if I drop this under my random effector, actually, let's drop it on top. There we go. Yeah, it's going to work better. So what it's going to do is it's going to basically take over for this PoseMorph tag. So the PoseMorph tag still works, but on my Morph Deformer, you can see I've got the same exact slider where I can slide it around just like that. But the nice thing is now I've got a fall off that I can apply. So that allows me to affect different points at different times in different ways, right? So if I change this to, say, a spherical deformer, or a fall off, and maybe we'll make this like 300 by 300 by 300. What I really want is that kind of red sphere area to be outside of all my points. If you can see that, I'm sort of moving that right now, and I want to make sure that it lies outside my points pretty effectively. So I'm going to say like 35% on that fall off, just so all the points are fully affected, right? So I'm going to go back to my object here. I'm going to slide this all the way up. And now, when I go back to my fall off and I change the scale, it's actually going to move those points based on that fall off. So I'll be able to make this animation a little bit more dynamic as I'm transitioning from cymatic pattern to cymatic pattern by going from center out. So it creates this kind of like rippling pulse effect, which is really cool. The other thing about this that we can do is actually play with the spline. If you want to have like a little overshoot, we could add a couple points to this spline down here because it's a fall off. So we add a couple of points, and now we have complete control over the way that this thing falls off over the duration. So if I take this slider and I push it up a little bit, what we're going to get as we move this scale across is actually a little overshoot, which is fun. Cool. So what I want to do really quick is I've actually rendered out a pretty simple example of what this ends up looking like. Show you guys really quick. So this is a simple example of morphing between 3 different cymatic patterns, which is cool. So we're going to come back to that in just a second because I actually have a brand new thing that I want to show you guys. I learned this yesterday, and it completely blew my mind. This is this is sort of the old school way of doing this, right? This very brute force, like Python method of doing this thing, sort of beat it with a hammer until it works. I've actually learned of a fantastic way to do this in R20 that I want to show you guys, because I literally fell out of my seat yesterday when they were showing me this. So we're going to start a brand new, oh, you know what? I'm in the wrong version. There we go. Cool. So we're going to jump over to R20, and I want to show you guys how to do the exact same thing in R20 in a super elegant way, and I hope I don't screw it up because I've only done this a couple of times. So what we're going to do is I've got my sort of base object created exactly the same way as I did before, with the plane, with the subdivisions up to 6, and then make it editable. I've got this very even distribution of points. So under MoGraph, I'm going to go and grab a Target Effector, and I'm going to drop that under here. And I'm going to change just a couple of things in the Target Effector. We're going to use fields for this, so the brand new fields feature in R20, which is ridiculously powerful, really, really cool stuff. So I'm going to change the target mode to field direction, which I'll explain in a minute. We're going to set this to repel, which I'll also explain shortly. And then under deformer, we're going to set the deformation to points. So I want to use the Target Effector to deform the points in the object, right? So sort of like I used the random effector to randomize the points. This one, I'm actually going to use the Target Effector to control the points. And now the really cool stuff happens under the fall off tab. So when I was using the Morph Deformer before, the fall off tab was very limited. It had like just a handful of options, and I could do like a sphere or a torus, or I could do a linear. The new fall off system is absolutely incredible. Like, the new fields are really, really amazing. So for this one, I'm actually going to use a shader field. So under here, I'm going to grab a shader field and drop that in. And I'm going to change just a couple of settings here in the shader field. For one, I want to add an image. So I'm going to add one of my weird cymatic patterns. I'm going to grab this guy. I'm going to throw that in here. Cool. So automatically this looks weird and broken, but you can tell it's doing something. Something is happening in here. I'm actually going to go under direction and turn off normalized direction. So if I go back to my target object, I'm going to change my distance. I'm going to reduce this distance value down. I'm going to say like maybe 15, right? So now if I change this distance strength with like 3 things, I've done all of that work in this incredibly elegant way. And this works exactly the same way with MoGraph. So if I make my little cube sand particle and set it to a value of 1, and we throw in a cloner, I'm going to do this guy here. We're going to set this to object mode, and we're going to set our subdivision surface to the object, and we're going to set this to be a vertex, and we're going to turn off the visibility on our subdivision surface. Now you can see if I go in here to the Target Effector, and I change this distance strength, now you can see I'm getting almost exactly the same thing, but it's got this like really cool kind of organic feeling, and it's so elegant, it's so simple, and intensely powerful. It's really, really cool. Like I said, I literally fell out of my seat yesterday when I saw this thing. Completely blown away. It was really, really amazing. So I'll run this sort of example again for you guys really quick, just to show you this sort of simplified example of how this could work. And that's what I've got for you guys today. Thank you very much. So if you want, you can check out, again, see our work at experienceperception.com. Follow Perception on Twitter. It's at exp_perception. And follow me on Twitter. I am at robotastronaut_. Awesome. Thank you guys very much.